I know. I said I wouldn't do another one of these for a while, but man, sometimes you come across a self-contradiction that you just cannot let stand without comment. And so, once more, into the breach.
A few years ago, I was sitting on a train and was reading this article in the New York Times Magazine that made this provocative claim. The reason why women haven't achieved gender equality with men in the professional sphere is because they don't want to.
Yes, I suppose it would be a shock to the system to learn that women are not being held back by an amorphous and monolithic male-centric conspiracy theory, but instead are making their own decisions that run counter to what other people think they should be doing. Heaven forfend that women exercise their own agency.
They have different aspirations now than previous generations of women. They'd rather be at home with their kids than be CEO of a company, or than be a prestigious university professor, or than be the big shot lawyer.
Whoa, wait a second. Women's aspirations now are to stay home and raise the kids, and this is different from women of previous generations. Women of previous generations had less desire to stay home and raise their kids? Women of previous generations were aiming to become CEOs and prestigious lawyers? I hope you're paraphrasing the article you read, because that doesn't make any sense. Let's see if I can find that article. Ah, this looks like it. Let's see here. Quote, "The 8 women in the room have each earned a degree from Princeton, which was a citadel of everything male until the first co-educated class entered in 1969. And after Princeton, the women of this book club went on to do other things that women once were not expected to do. They received law degrees from Harvard and Columbia. They chose husbands who could keep up with them, not simply support them. They waited to have children because work was too exciting. They put on power suits and marched off to take on the world. Yes, if an early feminist could peer into this scene, she would feel triumphant about the future. Until, of course, any one of these polished and purposeful women opened her mouth. I don't want to be on the fast track leading to a partnership at a prestigious law firm, says Catherine Brokaw, who left that track in order to stay home with her 3 children. Some people define that as success. I don't. I don't want to be famous. I don't want to conquer the world. I don't want that kind of life, says Sarah MacArthur Amsbury, who was a theater artist and teacher and earned her master's degree in English, then stepped out of the workforce when her daughter was born. Maternity provides an escape hatch that paternity does not. Having a baby provides a graceful and convenient exit. Sounds entirely reasonable to me. Women having the opportunity to do whatever they wanted and opting to focus on their families rather than a high-stress, time-consuming career in leadership. Now, it is a long article. Maybe I missed something in the reading of it, but I didn't see anything telling me that women of the past were less interested in family and more interested in working towards top positions. So, what are you talking about?
And this just didn't jive with my experience. It didn't jive with what I know about today's young women.
Oh, well, of course, your experience and point of view is the gold standard of reality. How dare these women stray outside the lines you have drawn for them?
We've seen record numbers of women going to law school and medical school, increasing shares of women in business programs. So I started to wonder, is there much evidence behind this claim? That today's women who are getting MBAs or getting law degrees or going for a PhD have decided to go home and raise kids instead of persevering in the professional realm.
Well, presumably the author of the New York Times article provided evidence to support the claims they were making. Let's see. Arguably, the barriers of 40 years ago are down. 50% of the undergraduate class of 2003 at Yale was female. This year's graduating class at Berkeley Law School was 63% women. Harvard was 46%. Columbia was 51%. Nearly 47% of medical students are women, as are 50% of undergraduate business majors, though interestingly about 30% of MBA candidates. They are recruited by top firms in all fields. They start strong out of the gate. And then suddenly, they stop. Despite all these women graduating from law school, they comprise only 16% of partners in law firms. Although men and women enter corporate training programs in equal numbers, just 16% of corporate officers are women. And only 8 companies in the Fortune 500 have female CEOs. Of 435 members in the House of Representatives, 62 are women. There are 14 women in the 100-member Senate. And the author goes on to cite other supporting data, including some numbers regarding the 1981 graduating class of Stanford University, of all places. And there is much, much more data that the author uses to support their claim. And from my reading of it, the author even seems somewhat disappointed to have reached the conclusion that they did. So it does not seem particularly biased. Wouldn't a good starting point be to check the author's evidence?
My specific research question was whether younger cohorts of women, so cohorts of women who were born in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, were working more or less than the cohorts of women that came before them.
Wait, working more or less? I thought the question was whether or not they were opting out of pursuing the big leadership positions, CEOs, surgeons, and partners in law firms. The article posits that they're not hitting these high positions due to choice. You're challenging that. At least, I thought you were. Now you're asking an entirely different question. Are women opting out of work? Period. Do you happen to work for a football team? Because I have another set of goalposts that need moving.
In order to capture the employment patterns of women who were born in the 1920s and 30s, when it was more unusual for women to be working, especially in fields like law and medicine, we need a really big sample. And so the obvious choice is the census. So I used data from the 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, and 2000 census, as well as the American Community Survey data from 2005 and 2010.
Okay, at least you're using a very, very large sample with the census. A little confused as to why you only chose 2005 and 2010 for the ACS data, though. The American Community Survey is basically a mini-census that is released every year, rather than every 10 years like the census. But, okay, do go on. Tell me that women are not opting out of work, rather than refuting that women are opting out of the high-end jobs.
The measures I look at are 3 measures of employment. I look at the most basic measure, whether people are in the labor force or not, also known as labor force participation. But I think it's also important to consider how many hours people are working. How intense is their labor force participation? So I look at the percentage of women who are working full year, full time, as well as the percentage of women who are working more than 50 hours a week, what I'll call working long hours. I wanted to look at women in their prime working years. So women over age 25 once they'd completed most of their schooling, and women under age 55 before they retire.
Sounds like a decent way of measuring the rate of female employment. Has nothing to do with refuting the claims made in the article, but please go on.
My analysis shows that women in the youngest cohorts, women in Generation X, who were born between 1966 and 1975, are working full-time, year-round, at much higher rates than any preceding cohort of women. They're also working long hours, that is, more than 50 hours a week, at higher rates than any preceding cohort of women.
Yes, women are working, and even working longer hours. But in what roles?
Now, there hasn't been as much change in labor force participation between Generation X and the baby boomers. We may have hit a plateau, but it's at a very high rate. And all the other employment measures tell us that women's employment and attachment to the labor force is increasing, not decreasing.
But in what roles are they working?
In order to better understand what's going on with these numbers and the overall trends in women's employment, we want to think about how the population of women who are working has changed over time. Since one of the biggest factors affecting women's employment is whether they have kids and the age of their kids, I broke down the population into 3 groups: women with young children, women with older children, and women who don't have children. And so I thought about how the percentage of women who are doctors and lawyers and in these professional careers who fall into each of these 3 categories has changed across cohorts, as well as how the behavior The employment rates of women in each of these categories is changing over time.
Great. Now, when do we get to the part about their making choices regarding the pursuit of high-end leadership roles? Did you even read the article whose conclusions you are challenging?
When we look at the percentage of women who are not enrolled in school and not working, or the percentage who have opted out, we see a dramatic decrease across cohorts. So what we see is about 31% of women in the baby boom parents cohort, women who would have been your great-grandparents, were not working, compared with about 5% of Generation X, women who have school-age children today. Despite all these media claims, the science does not support an opt-out phenomenon story.
Opt out of working? No. What about opting out of the high-end leadership roles? Anything? Anything at all?
We don't see that women are trading in paid work to stay at home and raise kids. Professional women are working more now than ever before, and there's no evidence that they're returning to more traditional patterns.
What about the evidence presented in the article? What did the author there get wrong? And weren't you out to disprove the article's claims?
And this suggests that the reason that gender equality has not yet been achieved may be other factors. It's not because women don't want these positions.
The positions? You've offered nothing about the positions, only rates of employment and hours thereof, divided along generational lines and family involvement. You're answering a question that no one asked.
Or aren't working hard. So we have to look to other explanations.
Other explanations for what? You didn't even address the central point of the article. Do you get paid to approach problems with what amounts to a non sequitur? Women are opting out of pursuing high-end positions. Well, that's just silly. Women are working more than they ever were. Well then, Professor, explain these numbers. Women are only 14.6% of executive officers, 8.1% of top earners, and 4.6% of Fortune 500 CEOs. They hold just 16.9% of Fortune 500 board seats. In the financial services industry, they make up 54.2% of the labor force, but are only 12.4% of executive officers and 18.3% of board directors. None are CEOs. And so on, and so on. This information is from 2014, whereas the article in question was from 2003. These numbers were entirely available to you. If they are incorrect, why aren't you refuting them? And if there is an explanation for them other than women making their own decisions, why aren't you showing it? My head hurts. Now, why do I keep subjecting myself to the incoherence of Stanford University? For you, dear viewer. It's all for you. As always, thanks for watching.